In a decision that reverberated across the nation, the Supreme Court has dramatically limited the executive branch's authority to impose tariffs under the banner of national security. The ruling in American Importers Alliance versus United States redraws the boundaries between Congress and the presidency on trade. For nearly a decade, aggressive tariffs upended global supply chains, raised costs, and sparked international retaliation. The era of tariff turmoil began in 2018, when tariffs were used as a blunt tool to protect domestic industries and pressure rivals. This marked a sharp break from decades of U.S. policy favoring free trade. Retaliatory tariffs from other nations soon followed, escalating into a costly trade war. The economic impact was profound, disrupted supply chains, higher prices, and uncertainty for businesses and consumers. At the heart of the legal battle was the question, who truly controls U.S. trade policy, Congress or the President? The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, but over time, statutes like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 delegated broad authority to the executive. The president could impose tariffs if imports threatened national security, but the definition of national security became a flashpoint. Today's Supreme Court decision ends years of legal wrangling and sets a new precedent for the limits of executive power in trade. In this video, we'll trace the rise and fall of tariff turmoil, examine its impact on industries and workers, and break down the Supreme Court's historic ruling. We'll also explore what this means for the future of American trade policy. The stakes could not be higher for the U.S. economy and its role in the world. The seeds of the tariff conflict were planted in the mid-2010s, but the real escalation began in 2018. The administration imposed tariffs on solar panels and washing machines, then quickly expanded to steel and aluminum, 25% and 10% tariffs respectively, citing national security. Allies like the EU, Canada, and Mexico called the move protectionist and hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods, from soybeans to bourbon. What started as targeted action ballooned into a multi-front trade war, disrupting billions in commerce. The conflict intensified with tariffs on Chinese goods, justified under Section 301 to address intellectual property theft. The U.S. targeted hundreds of billions in Chinese imports. China retaliated, hitting American agriculture hard. Farmers faced plummeting exports and prices, prompting federal aid. Uncertainty forced companies to rethink global supply chains, with some shifting production out of China. While some U.S. steelmakers saw short-term gains, manufacturers relying on imported metals faced higher costs. Studies showed that American importers and ultimately consumers bore most of the tariff costs. The trade war's economic pain and constitutional questions set the stage for a major legal showdown. Despite some new trade agreements, the broader tariff regime remained in place for years. The period from 2018 to 2024 was marked by volatility, higher prices, and a growing sense that the system was unsustainable. The legal challenge that would reach the Supreme Court was brewing. The nation waited for clarity on who truly controls U.S. trade policy. Tariffs didn't hit every industry equally. They created clear winners and losers. Domestic steel and aluminum producers thrived under protection, reporting record profits. But automakers like Ford and GM faced soaring costs for metals and imported parts, leading to higher car prices and squeezed margins. The agricultural sector was a prime target for retaliation. China, once the top buyer of U.S. soybeans, slashed imports by over 75%, devastating Midwest farmers. Federal aid helped, but many farmers wanted stable markets, not subsidies. Tariffs on Chinese goods rippled through consumer products, bicycles, furniture, electronics, forcing companies to choose between absorbing costs or raising prices. Inflation ticked up in tariff-affected categories, eroding household purchasing power. The uncertainty forced companies to rethink global supply chains, with many seeking to de-risk by moving production out of China. This shift was costly and disruptive, requiring new suppliers and logistics. The result? A patchwork economy where some sectors boomed while others struggled to survive. The tariff era forced a reckoning with the risks of global interdependence. For many businesses, the volatility was unsustainable. The legal battle over tariffs became a fight for economic survival. The Supreme Court's decision would determine whether this patchwork would persist, or if a new order would emerge. The stakes were not just economic, but existential for entire industries. The nation's economic future hung in the balance. The legal fight began as a wave of lawsuits from importers and manufacturers hit by tariffs. The U.S. Court of International Trade became ground zero, with companies arguing the president had overstepped constitutional bounds. The core issue: did Section 232 give the president too much unchecked power? Lower courts often sided with the government, citing precedent for broad executive authority in trade and national security. But the American Importers Alliance, representing thousands of companies, reframed the case as a fundamental separation of powers issue. They argued that letting the president define national security so broadly undermined Congress's constitutional role. This argument convinced the Supreme Court to take the case, setting up a historic confrontation. The stage was set for a decision that would reshape the balance of power in U.S. trade policy. Before the Supreme Court, the American Importers Alliance argued that Section 232 was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power. The phrase, "threatened to impair national security," was too vague, giving the president a blank check to impose tariffs for almost any reason. They showed how the law, once rarely used, had become a tool for sweeping economic intervention. The plaintiffs argued that Congress, not the president, should weigh the complex trade-offs of economic policy. They pointed to the Constitution's Commerce Clause, which gives Congress, not the executive, the power to regulate foreign trade. Allowing the president to dominate this sphere, they warned, would erode the separation of powers at the heart of American democracy. The case was about more than tariffs. It was about who governs. The government countered that Section 232 was clear. Congress gave the president discretion to act when national security was at stake. They argued that national security is broad and evolving, and the president needs flexibility to respond to new threats. Courts, they said, should defer to the executive on such matters, citing decades of precedent. The government pointed to job growth in steel and aluminum as evidence the tariffs worked. Limiting the president's power, they warned, could leave the nation vulnerable to economic coercion. Congress had the chance to change the law, but didn't, so the executive's authority should stand. The Supreme Court's 6-3 decision was a stunning rebuke of unchecked executive power. The court didn't strike down Section 232, but sharply limited how it can be used. The majority ruled that national security can't be a catch-all for economic protectionism. The president must now show a direct, credible link between an import and a real threat to defense or critical infrastructure. Tariffs based on broad economic arguments, especially against allies, were invalidated. The majority crossed ideological lines, emphasizing the need to protect Congress's constitutional role. The dissent warned the court was overreaching and tying the president's hands. The decision recalibrated the balance of power. The president's authority in trade is real, but not limitless. If the executive wants broad tariff powers, it must get explicit approval from Congress. The era of using a 1962 law as a blank check for trade wars is over. The Supreme Court's decision sent shockwaves through markets. U.S. stocks surged, especially in sectors hurt by tariffs: autos, tech, retail. Steel and aluminum stocks tumbled as investors anticipated renewed competition. The dollar dipped, reflecting expectations of increased imports. Global leaders welcomed the ruling, hoping for an end to retaliatory tariffs and a return to stable trade. The White House now faces the complex task of unwinding invalid tariffs and handling refund claims. Politically, the administration must choose accept the court's limits or seek new authority from Congress. For businesses, the ruling brings clarity but also new uncertainty as supply chains and strategies shift again. The decision doesn't erase underlying geopolitical tensions. All eyes are now on Washington to see how trade policy will evolve. The Supreme Court's ruling marks a turning point in American trade policy. It ends the era of executive-driven tariff turmoil and restores Congress's central role in regulating foreign commerce. The decision was a response to years of economic disruption and legal uncertainty. While the president retains some power, any sweeping use of tariffs now requires a clear, defensible link to national security or new authority from Congress. The ruling has sparked relief in markets and among U.S. trading partners, but the debate over trade's future is far from over. The court has handed the baton back to Congress and the president to forge a new consensus. The challenges of global competition and economic security remain. The question now: how will America wield its economic power in a changed world?